Welcome, everyone, to tonight's Serve America Movement National Webinar, brought to you by the Serve America Movement, made possible by SAM or the SAM Party, depending on the state in which you are joining us from this evening. I'm former Congressman David Jolly. I'm the chairman of the Serve America Movement. And for those of you who may not know fully about the Serve America Movement, we are a political reform organization that operates in the new party political space. We fundamentally believe that the United States would be a better body politic if we had more competition in the political space and if the United States had a multi-party democracy. So if you haven't learned about SAM fully, check us out at joinsam.org or check out some of our content at samstudio.org. Tonight is intended to be a conversation. There will be a Q&A at the end, so we hope you stick with us and participate in the question and answer period. You're also welcome to submit questions throughout tonight's conversation in the chat, and they'll be picked up by Zach Colby, who runs SAM's operations from our national headquarters in Denver, Colorado. But I want to get right to the conversation because we are privileged to have with us tonight one of the leading scholars and authors in the new party and election reform space. He is Lee Drutman. Lee is a senior fellow in the political reform program at the New America Foundation. Many of you will know him as the author of the Two-Party Doom Loop. And if you haven't picked up a copy of the Two-Party Doom Loop, please do so. It is not only an intelligent approach to today's duopoly, political duopoly in the United States, but Lee studies multi-party democracies across the country, across the world. We're going to talk about that tonight. It's all presented in a very approachable and informative way in the Two-Party Doom Loop. He's also an award-winning author for his work called The Business of America is Lobbying. And he's just out as a co-contributor to a book called Congress Overwhelmed: The Decline in Congressional Capacity and the Prospects for Reform. Lee holds his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and a BA from Brown University. Lee, with all of those accolades, thank you for being with us this evening.
Oh, no place I'd rather be.
All right. Hey, look, we're going to have this conversation about your work in the new party space and your studying and writings around multi-party democracies around the world. But knowing that a lot of the participants tonight come from different walks of political life, let's cover some of the basics first and foremost, because we will be talking about multi-party democracies. Give us some examples around the world of how countries we might think of or not think of when it comes to multi-party democracies, how they function in contrast to today's system in the United States of America.
Sure. Well, it's pretty much every other advanced democracy. The U.S. is a very strange and unusual two-party system. But, when I, think of thriving multi-party democracies, I think of New Zealand, I think of Australia, I think of Ireland, I think of Germany, I think of Denmark, I think of pretty much most of the, you look at the top 10 most functional democracies, you look at the top 10 on Freedom House, The Economist Intelligence Unit, whatever international metric you like for thriving democracies, and you will find that they're all multi-party democracies.
And multi-party being exactly what it sounds like, which is in the United States, we have two major parties that are kind of entrenched and protected through today's election laws in all 50 states. We have the Republican and Democratic Party. In other countries, it may be that there's a third party, but in some countries, there might be 5 or 8 or 10. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it varies depending on the voting system. So, you can have a somewhat extreme form of proportional representation like the Netherlands does, and they have 13 parties in their legislature. They just had an election. It's actually the same political system that Israel uses, although Israel is a bit more dysfunctional. It's probably you don't want that many parties. I think more like 4 to 6 parties is probably the sweet spot. So thinking like a country like Germany, which has I think, depending on the election, between 5, 6, maybe reasonably sized parties competing. That seems to me ideal because the political spectrum is diverse, and voters don't necessarily easily fit into one of two camps, and it makes sense that you want to represent the diversity of a country, especially a country as large and diverse as the United States.
Yeah, you mentioned the voter role in this, right? I mean, often we talk about the duopoly, or we talk in the United States about the Republican and Democratic Party. We kind of overlook the fact that fundamental to this entire conversation is the empowerment of voters, right? We are talking, as you mentioned, a very diverse voting population in the United States. But on the first Tuesday in November, that very diverse voting population is actually presented with only two choices, the Republican and Democratic Party, in terms of viability. Your research, as I mentioned, you're the author of a book called The Two-Party Doom Loop, and you refer to research that proves out that in multi-party democracies, you have greater voter participation, greater voter satisfaction, greater diversity. Talk a little bit about what the research shows from the voter perspective in multi-party democracies.
Absolutely. So I think one thing that people who are familiar with U.S. politics constantly complain about is the fact that we have very low voter participation in the U.S. And we have, the last election was a high point, and still even that puts us in the mid-range of advanced democracies. It's more typical to have voting participation at 55-60% in a presidential election, which is very low. Most Western European, other OECD democracies have voting participation rates closer to 70 or 80%. Now, a number of reasons why voter participation in the U.S. is low, but probably the main reason is that most voters live in districts and states where it's lopsided Democrat, lopsided Republican, so their vote doesn't matter, and that's a function of the two-party system and the way it meshes with our geography. Also, the fact that a lot of voters don't feel that either of the two parties really represents them, or feel that there's a party that they're excited to vote for. Now, you move to a proportional voting system with multiple parties, and what you have are one. Every vote counts equally. You don't have to live in a swing district in order for your vote to matter, or a swing state, because when votes are translated proportionally from votes to seats, every vote counts equally. Perhaps even more important is that now there's 5 or 6 choices, so you're much more likely to feel like there's a candidate or a party that speaks to you and represents you well. You don't feel like you're choosing the lesser of two evils, so why bother? And the parties and the campaigns themselves are out there actively recruiting voters and engaging voters. And right now, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are not that interested in engaging and recruiting voters because they don't need that many voters. In most places, partisan loyalty is just going to give them a safe seat or a safe win. And so what's the point of spending time and effort trying to figure out what voters think about or care about? They've just got the seat by right.
Yeah. Look, this is a little sidebar commentary, but I was talking to a member of the press recently about kind of this explosion of interest in new party politics since the events of January 6th. And one of the narratives of the new party political lane is there's a challenge for resources, right? The major parties have very deep pockets. The independent political lane really does not. But I was talking about that in the frame of trying to target those who have left their party since January 6th. And I said, what I find fascinating is that the independent political movement is moving quickly to the disaffected voters post January 6th, but I'm not seeing the Democratic Party do it. There's not this concerted outreach to people who have changed their registration in the past 3 months. Perhaps in part because they don't have to, perhaps in part because there's not a tent big enough on the left to accommodate people moving over from the right. But those are all other questions. As I mentioned, sidebar commentary. You hit on something kind of in comparing electoral systems in some of these multi-party democracies and the United States. It's not just that they have more than two parties, it's that they have an election system that kind of levels the playing field and allows more parties to participate, but gives voters more confidence in their participation. We're going to use a lot of terms tonight that need a little bit of explanation. You just used one, proportional representation. Within the electoral reform movement here in the United States, a few people talk about moving to proportional representation. And I want to break down some of the electoral reform initiatives that might help a new party movement. But let's start there. Proportional representation, how does that work? And I know you're a champion of bringing proportional representation to the United States.
Yeah, so let's back up to the point that you were saying before about how our system is not friendly to third parties. Now, what we have is single winner plurality elections in which individual districts are all single representative, and what that means when you have such a system is that it's very hard for third parties to compete, because people fear that if they're voting for a third party, that third party is going to suck away votes and make it so that the candidate that they would least like to see win actually wins. As I think many folks know, the problem is the spoiler effect. And as a result, all of the energy goes into the two major parties, and third parties are kind of treated as the hangouts for cranks and weirdos. And kind of don't get the resources from the political establishment. Now, it's not because Americans love the two parties, as I think you may know. Almost half or so of Americans now choose independent as their political identity. And about 2/3 of Americans say there ought to be more than two parties. Challenge is it's really hard to form a third party that would be more popular than one of the two major parties, precisely because there is a broad diversity of voters. And it's, there are a lot of people who are independent or, don't feel aligned with one of the two major parties, but they're not all concentrated in one political space. They're not all in the center. Some are, have different issues that they care about. They're sort of liberal and conservative. Liberal on some issues, conservative on other issues, and there's just a sense that the two parties don't really represent them well. Now, the proportional representation it describes a broader family of voting systems in which typically have some form of multi-member districts. So at the extreme end, we talked about the Netherlands. The entire country of the Netherlands is one electoral district, and they have a party-less system, which means that you vote for the party, but you have 20 parties to choose from or something, and then the parties get a share of seats in the legislature in proportion to how well they do across the country. Now, that probably yields too many parties, so a more common approach is to have, multi-member districts. I think 5 members is probably good. The version of proportional representation that I like is a system that's been used in Ireland for almost, I think going on 100 years now. It's multi-member districts with ranked choice voting, So they have 3 to 5 member districts, and then they have ranked choice voting on top of that, in which voters rank their candidates from most preferred to least preferred, and candidates are eliminated from the bottom up. So, Ireland typically has about 3 to 5 parties, a pretty strongly functioning democracy. And I think that's a pretty good system. There are some other systems of proportional representation that we can talk about if we want to go into the weeds more, which I'm certainly happy to do. But the basic principle is that you have multi-member districts, and then seats are allocated proportionally in accordance with how well parties do within larger districts. And the larger the districts, the more parties, the more proportionality. But at some point, you also worry about too many parties and too much fracture.
So ideally, if we were to bring proportional representation to our United States Congress, take a state that currently has 20 congressional seats, you might reduce that to 6 or 8. But within each of those 6 or 8 seats, you might have, or districts, you might have 4 people representing that district, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's something about odd numbers. You want to have odd numbers because of the way that the math works out. But so you take a 20-seat state and break it up into 4 5-member districts, and then everybody's vote. There'd be no more safe districts. There'd be no more gerrymandering, and parties different. You'd have more parties able to compete, because now, instead of needing to get 51% in a single district, you only need to get, the way the math works out is you need to get 17% in a 5-member district, across a much broader area. So, I mean, this is a challenge, because often, there are moderate voters, but they don't make up a majority in any given district, say, but across multiple districts, they might be 20%, and they should have a representative.
So for those who have just joined us since we started, welcome to this conversation with Lee Drutman, a senior fellow in the political reform program at the New America Foundation. We're talking about the independent political lane, the emergence of new party politics here in the United States, and we're comparing it to his studies and his writings regarding comparative democracies around the world. So as we mentioned, for a new party to emerge and for independent politics to have room to emerge, we do need election reform here in the United States. You mentioned proportional representation as one of your you're a leading proponent of it. We've yet to see that enacted in the United States, but we have seen other electoral reforms. We have seen ranked choice voting. We've seen open primaries, top 2, top 4 primaries. We're kind of living through this modern political era where we're experimenting with election reform. And the idea is to give the most number of voters greater voices, but also hopefully encourage greater competition and participation between the major parties and the minor parties. Let me ask you to explain for those attending, what did Alaska just do? Because what Alaska just did seems to be a transformative moment where we get to see it play out and see what works and what didn't.
Yeah, so Alaska, they had a ballot initiative that changed how they do elections. So they are starting in 2022. Now, the primary is going to be a top 4 primary. So it's the top 4 finishers in the primary. It's going to be a sort of nonpartisan. It's basically you think of it as a 2-round election. So the first round narrows it.
But so in the primary, Lee, just to be clear, Lee, in the primary, all candidates, regardless of party, show up on the same ballot, and all Alaskan voters go to the primary and get to choose.
Right.
And then the top 4 move on.
Top 4 move on, and then the general election is a ranked choice voting election. So Alaska becomes the second state, along with Maine, to have ranked choice voting for its elections, and Alaska is the first state to have the top 4 primary. There's a couple of states that have the top 2, California and Washington State, and Louisiana is kind of a modified version of that.
Yeah. So walk us through, Lee, how ranked choice voting works. My wife and I were having this conversation, and this is not it's a simple idea, but it's not intuitive for how Americans grow up in politics. Explain to us how ranked choice voting operates and what the outcomes are in terms of political and voter behavior.
Sure. Yeah, it's not intuitive because we've grown up with a very simple system. If you grew up in Australia, it would seem natural and intuitive to you because that's what you'd have been doing your whole life. And Australians who come to the U.S. say, "What? You only get to choose one? We get to rank them all. What's wrong with you?" So the basic idea is that rather than just selecting one candidate on a ballot, you rank them in order of preference. You say, this is my favorite candidate, this is my second favorite candidate, this is my third favorite candidate, and so on. Now, value of that is you can have your sincere preference, So, say I want to support you for governor of I don't know, say Florida, but, I'm worried that if I support you, I'll elect some Yahoo crazy Republican, and I'd rather have the Yahoo crazy Democrat. So, I'll vote for you. And if you
put me second,
I'll put you first. Because then, if you're at the bottom of the first preferences, then my votes will transfer to my second choice preference, so I won't have wasted my vote. And maybe you'll get the most first preferences, and then the other voters, somebody else will have their voters transfer to you. But the idea is it's a better way of aggregating preferences across multiple candidates, and it ensures that in a single winner format, it ensures that the candidate who wins actually has the majority of support. So it prevents the vote splitting problem, it prevents the spoiler problem, and it also changes how people campaign, because you are trying to build a broader coalition by reaching out to voters who might not choose you as their first choice, but might choose you as their second choice or your third choice. And it encourages more compromise-oriented coalition building, less zero-sum style campaigning. And voters generally like it because they feel like they express their full range of preferences rather than just limiting it to choosing one.
Yeah, Lee, so much of the election reform narrative is around shifting the incentive structure for political behavior of not just candidates, but elected officials. I mean, that one of the greatest lessons for me from my service in the United States Congress, because I was in a 50-50 district, a Republican that Obama had won, I had to think about a much broader political coalition than just my Republican Party. But I was in the vast minority of members who had to worry about that. Most members, once you're elected, you're protected by closed primaries and gerrymandered districts. And so your behavior is incentivized by only the partisan rewards. And so you behave as a partisan. And what you're describing is a system in which ultimately we have behaviors that reflect a greater consensus of political opinion, and as reflected by the voters. I want to bring in very shortly the chair of SAM Texas, Bill King. But before we do that, I want to ask one last question of you. One of the criticisms we often get, in the new party movement, the electoral reform movement, is, look, Americans really are a 50-50 country. Right? When we register to vote, maybe we register a third, RD and I, or maybe nationally that trend of no party affiliation is closer to 50. But look, on the first Tuesday in November, we perform as Republicans and Democrats. It would seem to me, my theory of the case is it's because we're given a false choice on the first Tuesday in November. But is that right or not? You've studied this. Why is it at the point of registration we might self-select a third, but on the first Tuesday in November, we really perform 50-50. How do you explain that?
Well, we have two choices. So we respond to the choices that we have. You know, if you go to the supermarket and
but Lee, let me push back. Let me push back just a second. We do see other choices. I mean, we see no party affiliated candidates, or we see a libertarian or green candidate, but they never move more than single digits. Um, is it that they're not presented in equity with RMDs, or
well, I mean, it's the spoiler effect, right? I mean, there might be people who would prefer some other party, but I mean, the reality is that people mostly see a difference between Democrats and Republicans, and there's a lot of people who, you know, while they might not be super enthusiastic about the Democratic Party, they definitely don't want the Republican Party, and a lot of people who might, you know, not be particularly enthusiastic about the Republican Party, but they definitely don't want the Democratic Party. So there's a lot of negative partisanship. And if you vote for a third party, you're increasing by withholding your vote, you know, from the party that you are, you know, not enthusiastic about, but more enthusiastic about. You're actually helping the party that you would be terrified if they came into power, and that's the spoiler effect that follows from plurality voting that we have. Now, there's, you know, a broader, you know, structural issue just about how politics is covered, and, you know, and who is doing the you know, the organizing, the fundraising, and where all the political ambition goes. So, I mean, if you're an aspiring politician, you know, you can work your way up in the Democratic Party, you can work your way up in the Republican Party, and you're going to be taken seriously. You're going to get all this campaign funding infrastructure. You're going to get the brand. You're going to get the loyalty, and that's a lot easier of a path. And as a result, that's where, you know, pretty much all the energy goes. And, you know, so most voters who are engaged in politics, you know, say, well, okay, you know, I need to pick one of these two because these are the only serious options, right? You know, it's like, you know, there's two restaurants in town, and, you know, sure, you could go to the, you know, the truck stand behind the alley that, you know, smells weird, but, like, you know, better to go to one of the two major establishments.
Yeah, you know, we consume our politics much like we consume everything else in America by brand. And we grow up with two brands in politics, and it's really hard to get past that. That's human behavior. But the remarkable thing is it forces us into associations that may not actually reflect who we are. I'm intrigued by this concept of big tent, because what the Serve America movement, what the SAM party is building is a big tent, right? We coalesce instead of around shared ideology, right? We all go to this one spot on the left-right spectrum. Instead, we say, bring whatever ideology you have, left, right, or middle, because we want the best answers. We're going to coalesce around shared values of problem solving and accountability, transparency, electoral reform. And in my own political journey, as I left, in my case, the Republican Party, and am an independent, a lot of Democrats have said, hey, just become a Democrat. And I said, I don't fit. And they say, no, you don't understand. We're a big tent. Big tent to the two parties is a challenge for them to reach all the way to the middle, right? Democrats go from the left to the middle on some issues. Republicans go from the right to the middle, perhaps on some issues. That's not a big tent. That's a half a tent. And what we're trying to do at SAM is build a big tent coalition that brings in all ideologies. We're trying to do it within the challenges, not just of today's election laws, and in all 50 states they're different, the challenges that have been put in place, but also within voter behavior, which is kind of the root of what we're talking about tonight. You mentioned the spoiler effect. I want to bring into this conversation Bill King. Bill runs the SAM Texas operation. And for those of you who are joining us from Texas, you want to be in touch with Bill. If you're not in Texas, watch what's happening in Texas. Stay tuned for some big announcements in the next coming months. A former candidate himself for mayor of Houston as an independent, Bill brings a rich history of Texas politics that he continues to translate for me as I try to learn about Texas. But Bill, thanks for being with us. You had some questions exactly along these lines for Lee.
Yeah, David, I've been trying to teach you how to use y'all, and so far I haven't had much success.
Just teach me how to punctuate y'all, and I'll be good.
Lee, it's nice to put a name with a book. I've really enjoyed the book and have recommended it to a lot of friends. I want to drill down on this spoiler issue a little bit more because it's a question I get a lot when promoting the idea of a third party. And I sort of have a theory I want to try out on you. I mean, currently we have two alternative parties, the Green and the Libertarian, which most people see as further out on the political spectrum than the Republican and the Democrats. And so it's pretty easy to see that if somebody votes for one of those two parties, they're taking away from two of the two major parties. But if we had a party that more occupied the middle part of the spectrum, was not as ideologically driven, would that in some way address the spoiler effect, you think?
I'm not sure it would, unfortunately. Because I don't think that there are, based on my analysis of public opinion data, I don't see there being all that many voters who are sort of in the middle. There are voters who are sort of caught between the two parties because they're liberal on some issues and conservative on other issues. But I think what intrigues me about the Serve America movement as a party is that it's not so much that you're aiming for the political center, but you're aiming for something that's kind of an off dimension in a sense. Like you're talking about the political process and how we do politics. So that it's a second dimension on what's a flattened left-right spectrum. You're trying to elevate a different set of issues. And that's actually, to me, much more consistent with the history of successful third parties, is that successful third parties in the history of American politics have raised issues that the two parties were largely ignoring. You can think of the populists in the 1890s talking about the currency issue when both parties were basically captured by the Eastern banker establishment. You can think of the Progressive Party in the 1920s when both parties were also captured by the Eastern banker establishment. And you can think of the Republican Party in the 1850s, really focused on an issue of slavery that both of the two major parties were trying to avoid because it was potentially divisive to them. So I think the way to think about successful third parties is that they blow up the spectrum because they change the dimensionality of political conflict.
Great. Thanks for the answer.
Hey, I like that answer.
Yeah. I'm going to turn it back to you because I see there's
Bill,
a lot
you got
questions here.
Okay, hey, so we're going to bring in Zach Colby. Zach Colby, as I mentioned, kind of runs our operations for the Serve America movement out of Denver. He's got a list of questions that are coming in. If you haven't asked your question yet, please submit it. Before we get to the first question, I'll lead with this, Lee. Gallup came out with that poll recently. Over 60% of the country says now's the time for a third party. But your conversation with Bill was an intriguing one. It doesn't seem that over 60% is a monolithic group. I mean, right? Well, certainly within that 60%, you have loyal R's and D's. How do you break down that poll number?
Well, there's actually an analysis that I did, a report that you can Google called Spoiler Alert, in which I ran a survey and asked people, one, do you want a third party? And then asked people where they wanted that third party to locate on different sets of issues. And from that, you get about 20% of people would like a party that's more liberal than the Democratic Party. 20% want a party that's kind of in the middle, and 20% want a party that's more conservative than the Republican Party. So, it's as well as little off-dimensional stuff. I'm simplifying the numbers a little bit.
Sure.
But which is precisely why, if there were a third party that had could occupy an issue space that was more popular than one of the two major parties, the third party would succeed. But the two major parties are pretty good at kind of locating in a place on the ideological landscape to prevent third parties from eating their lunch, because they sort of see where things are going. But that leaves a lot of people out, because there's people who are all over the political spectrum. So if that 60% all wanted the same party, you would have that party. But that a lot of folks who are disaffected with the two parties are disaffected for different reasons.
Yeah. Very good. All right, Zach Colby, what do you have for us?
Thanks for being with us, Lee. And we've seen 5 or 6 questions come in about gerrymandering. I want to ask one specific question and then talk about it more generally. This is from William Taggart. He says, some have indicated that not allowing zip codes to be split across political districts could be a means to rein in gerrymandering in a way that could stand up to a Supreme Court judgment. Do you think this would be a good first step? And then I think it would be good to sort of talk about gerrymandering and how it hinders third-party competition in general, especially in an important year when districts are being redrawn.
Great. Well, I'm glad folks asked about gerrymandering, because I think gerrymandering is a bit of a red herring in this conversation. I have no defense of gerrymandering. I think it's a troubling practice, but I think that we often blame gerrymandering for the lack of competitive congressional districts. And the reason that we don't have competitive, that there is some gerrymandering that does that, but the much bigger problem is that Democrats and Republicans just live in very different places. So if you're going to keep communities, if you're going to make districts that make some coherent sense, in terms of having communities together, in terms of some level of compactness, you're just going to wind up with a lot of lopsided districts. The cities are overwhelmingly Democratic. You're going to wind up with a lot of overwhelmingly Democratic districts in cities. A lot of exurban, small town, rural places are overwhelmingly conservative, Republican, and you're just going to wind up with a lot of districts that are safe no matter what process you use to draw the districts. And in many ways, gerrymandering actually makes districts more competitive than they would be, because now that we're in the era of partisan gerrymandering, the old era of gerrymandering was incumbent protection gerrymandering, which did contribute somewhat to making districts safer. Now we're in an era of partisan gerrymandering, when the parties that control the legislatures are trying to maximize their seat share, and that means that they want to spread their voters out more efficiently. Which actually makes districts potentially more competitive than they would be. There's nothing about gerrymandering that prevents third parties from being able to compete. It's the fundamental core problem is the single member district. That's what makes gerrymandering so dangerous and productive. You move to proportional multi-member districts, and gerrymandering largely becomes irrelevant. There's still a little bit of it, but when you've got 4, 5-member districts in it, there's just a lot less room to play around with, and you're going to get seat shares that are proportional to the vote shares, however you draw the line. So I'm certainly supportive of independent redistricting commissions. I think it's absurd that partisan legislatures draw districts, but I just don't see gerrymandering as being a core driver of the partisan polarization. I think it's a problem, because it can potentially allow a party that has a minority of voters to use its advantage to have a majority of seats, which is to me an anti-democratic practice. But it's also something that just flows. It's a problem of single member districts. Single member districts are not good at partisan fairness. And there's been a lot of political science work that looks at the effects of gerrymandering, and gerrymandering, like I said, has some harmful causes, but it hasn't driven polarization by most political science accounts. I haven't seen one that attributes polarization to gerrymandering. As ugly as many of these districts are, but state boundaries are also kind of weird in many places too.
Hey, Lee, can I ask a question as Zach tees up this next one? And only because you've spoken to this before and I found it fascinating. A lot of people intuitively, myself included, think that the opportunity for a new party is in a purple community, right? People look at the state of Florida and say it's so purple that's where a new party could emerge. But I've heard you make the case that actually it's in these kind of super majority partisan districts or states where you might actually see a new party become more viable.
Yeah, I think so. Because when you have, large majority of one party, what you actually have are probably clearer divides within those parties. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C., which is a 90%, Democratic city. But, within the sort of that 90%, I could see probably 2 or 3 Democratic parties if we had a more proportional voting system. So I mean, often that supermajority hides a lot of dispute. I mean, even California is pretty much a supermajority Democratic state at this point, but there's a definite divide within the Democratic Party between a more kind of centrist business friendly version of the Democratic Party and a more socialist left version of the Democratic Party. And those competing factions are vying for control within the Democratic Party. And so it would make sense to encourage, those factions to split up and run independently so voters could be clear on, what Democratic Party they're actually supporting, instead of having these fights in primary elections.
Got it. Very good. Zach, what you got next for us?
This is another question that's been asked by a couple different audience members, one by Harvey Jassam and one by an anonymous attendee. They say, won't more parties only result in a greater chance for a smaller group of fringe voters potentially gaining control? And for example, Sanders followers could have easily overtaken recent elections had there been 4 to 6 parties, as you describe as the sweet spot. And someone else cited Israel as an example.
Yeah, I think it's the opposite. I mean, right now, what we have are fringes of both parties, but I would say especially the Republican Party having taken over one of the 2 major parties and, ruling as a plurality of a plurality. Now, the difference, we can separate presidential from congressional elections. I think if we had in the reality at the presidential level, we'd probably have, given, unless we change the Electoral College, we'd probably have, similar coalitions forming at the presidential level. Although, we could talk about how presidential elections would be different. I think they'd be more center oriented because you'd have these different coalitions, but the real place where you'd see the parties emerging would be in Congress. And what you see, and I think you'd have a much stronger Congress because Congress would be more representative of the American people, and also would be less overcome by binary partisan bickering, which it weakens it vis-a-vis the presidency. But the reality is that when you have a multi-party system, parties actually need to form majorities to govern. You can think about the kind of the extremist parties in European systems, which exist, but because they are minorities, they can't if they were going to be in government, they'd have to form a much broader coalition that would limit their ability. Now, the other reality is that they tend to be kept on the fringes, because what you see are kind of center out coalitions forming. I mean, you look at Germany, right? They've had far right parties for the AfD for a few years, and what you see is a Merkel, which is has a government. She's her party is center right. They partner with the center left, and they govern from the center out. It's a similar thing you see in a lot of European countries, is the kind of center out coalition, as opposed to the fringes on one side ruling or the fringes on the other side ruling. To build that majority coalition, it has to inherently involve the center, and that is a fundamental difference. And as for Israel, I feel like every conversation that I have about multi-party democracy, somebody says, "What about Israel? What about Israel?" Israel is one country that has particular history, that has it's a country that has been at war for a very long time. It's a country that's actually, despite being a small country, it's actually an incredibly diverse country. And it's a country that has, I think, been increasingly radicalized by its conflict with its enemies. Or a lot of folks in Israel have been radicalized. So I'm not sure how much you can blame the chaos in Israeli politics on the multi-party system. It's true that they've had 4 elections in the last 2 years, and they've had a hard time forming coalitions. I don't want to say that multi-party democracies are these beautiful, magical fantasy places where all the trees are always in bloom and with beautiful fruits. But I think that the fundamental problem that we have in American democracy right now is we have 2 parties that are entirely stuck where they are, and they are running on fumes, and those fumes are all about hating on the other side. And multi-party democracy allows us to break that, what I call, breaking the 2-party doom loop. It's a doom loop, and gives us a way to think about realigning our politics, building new coalitions, working towards new solutions. And if you look at you look at the options given our current political system and where things are taking us, they are taking us down, down, down as the escalation goes up, up, up.
And Lee, I think that the thread you continue to weave through all of this is the winner-take-all election system we have in a 2-party duopoly. And to your point, if we have the emergence of minor parties that perform at the ballot box with 15, 20, 30%, we're giving greater voice to voters. But that doesn't mean that those parties now have a majority. They have to form a coalition. And at the end of the day, what all of this is driving towards is a greater consensus among the governing to better reflect a greater consensus among the governed. And I think that's one of the fundamental premises of the independent political lane. Zach, what do you have for us next?
Yeah, Lee, you briefly touched on it, and this is an interesting question, and maybe opening up a big can of worms, but it's from Dale Zarowski. What do you think about abolishing the Electoral College?
Well, I'm in favor of abolishing the Electoral College. I mean, it's a weird institution that never worked the way it was intended to, and is sort of a strange anachronism. But I mean, it would require a constitutional amendment. So I think that it would be very hard to get a constitutional amendment at this point, given the nature of our politics. There have been 4 times in our political history in which one of the 2 chambers of the Congress has passed the constitutional amendment. and then it got blocked in the other. There's actually a wonderful book that came out last year by a Harvard historian, Alexander Kisar, called "Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?" which it's a long book. You can read my review of it in the Washington Monthly if you don't want to read the entire book. But the TLDR is that from the very beginning, people in Congress realized that this was a mistake, and there have been ups and downs of trying to get rid of it, and for some reason it still sticks because it's really hard to have a constitutional amendment that changes a fundamental institution of our government when there's at some point one of the two parties or some faction that has enough seats in one of the houses says, well, if we get rid of this, then it'll help the other party. And which is fundamentally problem of this binary logic is it's zero sum. So if we this institution might make no sense, but it helps us, so we have to hang on to it because then the other side is going to get total power, and it's
So, Lee, short of a constitutional amendment, though, you have seen states change how they award their electors, and that's permissible, right?
It is permissible. I'm not sure.
So you've seen states say we're going to award our electors to whomever wins the national
popular
will
vote
get our state.
Which now is all it's all, pretty much all the blue states have signed on to it. None of the purple states, none of the red states, and I think that's as far as it's going to go. Purple states don't want to sign on to it because it means that then suddenly they're not the key swing states anymore. The red states aren't going to sign on to it, or if the red states sign on to it, it'll mean that the Electoral College is helping the blue states, and then the blue states are all going to unsign from it. So,
Got it.
Got it.
All right. Hey, Zach, what do you have next for us? Go ahead.
This one is from Tom Cardinal. Are there any peaceful examples in the 20th or 21st centuries of nations breaking away from a two-party systems and into a multi-party system? If so, what lessons can be learned that we might take away and apply to our country? And I think just we can generally talk about how these thriving multi-party democracies came about, how they were designed, and how we can take those lessons and applying them to fixing our doom loop.
Yeah. So the story I love is New Zealand. Now, New Zealand was a first past the post two-party democracy, very basically the Westminster UK model, and New Zealand politics started to get all wonky and dysfunctional in the late 70s, early 80s. There's just incredible dissatisfaction. There's plurality reversals, and New Zealanders were looking for a better way to vote. And there was a royal commission that urged New Zealand to adopt a proportional voting system. They actually copied the German model, and New Zealanders overwhelmingly supported the change. Politicians initially resisted it, but eventually got on board. And New Zealand went from being a largely dysfunctional to one of the most thriving democracies in the world. And then they made that change in the 1990s. They had two national referenda in 92 and 93. So I think that's a success story. The most of the Western European democracies that adopted proportional representation did so in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The first country to do it was Belgium, which most historians would say that Belgium basically averted a civil war by doing so. And there were various different reasons why different countries adopted it, but broadly the politics aligned. And at the time, it was a time of democracy reform and enfranchisement, and most people thought it was just a fair system because it treats all voters fairly, and it kind of caught on in that period. So I think but the lesson from New Zealand, which I think is more relevant, is that at a certain moment when enough people are dissatisfied with a political system that they feel like isn't working for them, that a movement can build to offer a better solution. And when presented with that solution, I mean, New Zealanders overwhelmingly supported the change.
Hey, Zach, a couple more questions before the bottom of the hour.
Yep. This is kind of bringing together a bunch of questions we've seen in the chat and that have gotten submitted, essentially talking about how there are so many electoral hurdles for a third party to emerge. A lot of questions about ranked choice voting, a lot of questions about open primaries. What do you see as sort of the top tier priority for us to reform our election system, and how do we get that done?
Yeah, I mean, I think multi-member districts with ranked choice voting. There's the Fair Representation Act in Congress, which would do that. I've been looking. I've spent the last few weeks looking very closely at the literature, political science literature on open primaries, and I was surprised to find that open primaries basically make no difference in terms of who gets elected. Open, closed, it has really no impact. Top two primary in California has had a very minimal impact at best. It just doesn't seem to matter. Whatever the primary rules, the voters who participate in primaries, are small, and it turns out there's just not all that much difference between primary and general election voters in terms of their ideology, despite the conventional wisdom. I think there's. I was surprised there's basically among political scientists who studied it, and a lot have, there's pretty much universal agreement that the primary reform is barking up a barren tree.
Very good. And we actually had a question related to the Fair Representation Act. This is maybe a good one for either of you to answer, from Dan Eckham. How can voters put pressure on elected officials to make these reforms, such as the Fair Representation Act? What can a viewer do tonight when they go home, or what can they do tomorrow to help push these reforms forward?
Well, they can talk to their representatives and ask them to co-sponsor the Fair Representation Act. They can, I think we're in a moment in which a lot of these reforms are still kind of new to people. So it's about talking to people. And saying, hey, have you thought about this? And there are some local campaigns to try to change election rules, but I think this movement is still in its infancy. So I wish I had better ways for people to plug in at this point, and hopefully we will in the weeks and probably in the months to come. But for now, it's just great to be part of these conversations.
Absolutely.
Lee, you hit on an interesting point. We really are in a modern political era where a lot of the election reform movement is young, and the data that you're getting as a researcher is emerging. And so when you're talking to politicians, elected politicians in particular, we're still in the education phase of getting them to understand the impact and some of the definitions, right? Multi-member districts and so forth. And it's been interesting to see there are people in Congress who sign on to it when you can educate them. But I think that's where we are. We're at the education stage, and it is worth spending time with your elected officials to educate them. Hey, Zach, I think we got time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
All righty. This one is a little more related to kind of the social construct around the two parties. How do you convince someone to leave their camp and vote for a third party member in our current electoral system?
Shrug. I mean, it's hard because the parties. There's a huge difference between the parties, and it's really challenging to convince somebody to support a third party, which is why it's hard for third parties. Now, I guess the argument would be that you have to take a longer view of things, and I think the approach to historically third parties in the U.S. have not sought to win elections, but rather to change the debate by highlighting issues and positions that were left out of the debate, the limited debate between the two parties. So you have to say, well, I'm voting to make a statement, and that statement is more important than whether the Democrat or the Republican wins. Which is a hard thing to do, given that the parties are very different at that point. So it's about thinking, what are the repercussions of this? I think if you talk to Ralph Nader, and I have, he'd say, in 2000, look, I didn't expect to win. I just wanted the Democrats to steal my issues. And I thought the only way I could get them to listen was, to run as a third party candidate. And that's historically been the role of third parties. So I think you have to think about, what is the message that I'm sending, and it's longer term than whether or not somebody wins. And it's for a presidential election, that's pretty important. But for a Senate election, maybe it's a little more ability to register that. For a House election, even more ability. For a gubernatorial election, So you have to be comfortable with sending a statement saying, look, what I'm voting for is I'm making a statement, and if I don't do that, then you're never going to listen to me, because how else am I going to protest?
You got to send the message, right, Lee? So I would agree with that. You're making a statement, but I would also say your vote is deeply personal. Vote your conscience, because I think each of us can think back on votes that we regret. And perhaps it's because we truly believed in somebody who then later disappointed us, but perhaps it's because we compromised with our own convictions to try to accept this duopoly. And, I'm at the point in my political career, whether I'm in office or not, I know how I'm going to exercise my suffrage and exercise my vote. And it's going to be based on my conscience. And I'm not going to leave a voting booth with regret ever again. I don't worry about issues like the spoiler effect. I'm committed to creating greater competition in today's American political scene, which is why I'm involved with the Serve America movement. Folks, he is a senior fellow in the political reform program at the New America Foundation. As I mentioned, an award-winning author known to the New Party political movement for his work called The Two-Party Doom Loop, but also an award winner for the book, The Business of America is Lobbying. He is also out as a contributor for a new piece that studies the capacity of the United States Congress and reforms that might be needed to the lower house. He is Lee Drutman. Lee, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you. This was a great pleasure.
You got it. And also with us, you have met Zach Colby, who, as I mentioned, runs our operations for the Serve America movement out of Denver, Colorado. You have met Bill King, who is the chairman of the Texas SAM movement. Soon to be a party. I believe we will get there very soon. Keep an eye on what's going on in Texas for the Serve America movement. I'm former Congressman David Jolly, the chairman of SAM. And if you have not yet looked into SAM, please do so. Go to joinsam.org or our content-driven site at samstudio.org. Thank you for being a part of this conversation tonight with Lee Drutman. Look for more information from SAM in your email box in the days to come. Thank you all. Appreciate it very much.